His German shepherd wouldn't stop digging beneath the snow-covered hill. And when the veteran finally looked where the dog was staring, he realized the abandoned mansion wasn't the strangest thing on the property. The flashlight beam shook across the frozen ground as Mack barked furiously at a patch of earth behind the mansion. Wind howled through the broken windows. Somewhere beyond the darkness, metal clanged once, then went silent. The old veteran dropped to one knee, brushing snow away with numb fingers while the dog refused to back down. Then something appeared beneath the dirt, and neither of them expected it. What do you think Mack had found? The first thing Calvin Brooks noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful kind. Not the kind that settles over a mountain valley at sunset. This silence felt abandoned, forgotten, as if the land itself had stopped expecting people a very long time ago. Calvin eased his 12-year-old pickup truck through the rusted iron gate and let it roll down the overgrown gravel drive. Tall weeds scraped against the doors. Dry branches dragged across the side mirrors with a sound like fingernails on metal. Beside him, Mack lifted his head from the passenger seat. The German shepherd's ears stood up, alert, watching, always watching. Calvin reached over and scratched the thick fur behind the dog's neck. "Easy, partner." Mack glanced at him briefly before turning his attention back to the road ahead. The valley opened suddenly, and Calvin froze. For several seconds, he simply sat there, with both hands gripping the steering wheel. The mansion stood at the center of the propa, like something left behind by another century. Gray stone walls rose from the earth. 2 stories. Broken windows, a sagging roofline. Vines climbed the exterior like green veins wrapping around old bones. Yet even in ruin, the place possessed a strange dignity. The kind that made a man straighten his back without realizing it. The kind that hinted at stories nobody remembered anymore. Calvin stepped out of the truck. The Wyoming wind hit his face immediately. Cold, dry, carrying the scent of pine trees and distant snow. For a moment he simply stared. Then he noticed the vehicles. 1, 2, 5, 9, 11. 11 rusting automobiles scattered across the property. Some sat half-buried in grass. Others leaned awkwardly where their tires had collapsed decades ago. A faded red pickup, a military-style Jeep, an old station wagon, a sleek convertible that looked as though it had once belonged in a movie. Every one of them abandoned exactly where it had stopped, as if their owners had planned to come back tomorrow, and never did. But the cars weren't what truly caught his attention. The airplanes did. 2 twin-prop aircraft rested near the edge of the valley beyond the mansion. Their wings stretched above the grass like giant sleeping birds. Sunlight reflected from weathered aluminum. One propeller was bent. The other aircraft appeared almost untouched. Calvin slowly removed his cap. "Well," he muttered. "Didn't mention those in the auction listing?" Mack hopped down from the truck. His paws landed softly in the grass. The dog stared toward the plains, then toward the mansion, then toward the dark tree line beyond. His nose twitched. Something had his attention. Something Calvin couldn't see. A week earlier, Calvin had been sleeping behind a truck stop outside Casper. The medical bills from his wife Diane's cancer treatments had swallowed everything. The house, the savings, the retirement account, all gone. The government check covered food, sometimes. The truck covered shelter, most nights. Mack covered everything else. The dog had entered his life 2 years earlier, after being abandoned at a county shelter. Older, scarred, quiet. The shelter worker said nobody wanted him because he was too old. Calvin understood that feeling immediately. Since then, they had become a team. 2 discarded souls moving through the world together. Now somehow they owned a mansion, or at least the remains of one. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "You actually bought it." Calvin turned. A dusty pickup had pulled onto the property behind him. An older man climbed out. Overalls, gray beard, weathered face. The look of someone who had spent his entire life outdoors. "You Calvin Brooks?" Calvin nodded. "That's me." The man walked closer. His eyes never left the mansion. "Name's Earl Jensen. My ranch borders the North Ridge." Calvin offered a handshake. Earl accepted. His grip was strong. "Beautiful place," Calvin said. Earl snorted. "Depends who you ask." Neither man spoke for a few seconds. The wind moved through the valley. Somewhere far away, a hawk cried. Finally, Earl looked directly at him. "You know what folks around here call this place?" Calvin shook his head. "The Hale property. The people who owned it used to." Earl glanced toward the airplanes, then toward the mountains. Something unreadable crossed his face. A memory, a regret, maybe both. Calvin waited. But Earl didn't continue. Instead, he stuffed his hands into his pockets. "If you're smart," he said quietly, "don't stay here after dark." Calvin almost smiled. He'd heard warnings like that before. Small towns always had stories. Haunted houses, lost mines, ghost lights. Usually nothing. "What happens after dark?" Calvin asked. Earl looked at the mansion, then at the woods behind it. His expression hardened. "That's the thing." He climbed back into his truck. Nobody ever seems to agree. A moment later he drove away, leaving Calvin standing alone in the valley. The sun continued sinking behind the mountains. Long shadows stretched across the property. The temperature dropped quickly. Calvin unloaded supplies, a sleeping bag, a lantern, canned food, a toolbox, the few possessions he still owned. Mack followed him everywhere, never more than 10 feet away. As dusk settled over the valley, Calvin stood on the mansion's front porch. The old boards creaked beneath his boots. He looked out across the field, the cars, the airplanes, the endless Wyoming wilderness. Everything he owned now fit inside this forgotten place. Strangely, that thought didn't scare him. Not yet. Night arrived fast. The mountains swallowed the last sunlight. Darkness spread through the valley. Calvin lit a lantern inside the mansion. Golden light pushed back the shadows. Barely. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Branches swayed. The old structure groaned occasionally. Normal sounds. Old house sounds. At least that's what Calvin told himself. Mack sat beside a broken window, perfectly still, watching. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The dog never moved. His eyes remained fixed on the forest behind the mansion. The same section of woods, the same patch of darkness, again and again. Finally, Calvin walked over. "What is it?" Mack didn't react. His ears remained forward, body tense, focused. Calvin followed the dog's gaze. The forest stood silent beneath the moonlight. Nothing moved, nothing visible anyway. Yet something deep inside him stirred. An old instinct, the same instinct that had kept him alive overseas. The feeling that someone was watching, from very far away and very patiently. Mack released a low growl, not loud, not aggressive, just enough. Calvin felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. Outside, beyond the mansion, beyond the field of rusting cars, beyond the 2 silent airplanes, something waited in the darkness. And whatever it was, Mack had noticed it first. Calvin remained beside the broken window for nearly a minute, staring into the black wall of pine trees beyond the field. Nothing moved, no flashlight, no vehicle, no sound except the wind. Yet Mack's posture never changed. The German shepherd sat rigid as stone, eyes fixed on the same point in the forest. Calvin had learned long ago to trust that kind of focus. Dogs noticed things people missed, sometimes by seconds, sometimes by miles. Finally, he drew the curtain of an old blanket across the shattered window frame. Enough for tonight. Mack didn't seem convinced, but he followed Calvin deeper into the mansion. The lantern cast long shadows across the enormous foyer. Dust floated through the golden light. The staircase rose into darkness above them. Every step creaked somewhere in the house. Wood settling, old beams shifting, normal sounds. At least that was what Calvin told himself. He chose a corner of the main sitting room that gave him a clear view of every entrance. Old habits. He laid out his sleeping bag against a stone wall, positioned the lantern, placed his flashlight within reach, knife beside it, truck keys in his pocket. Even after all these years, he never slept without knowing exactly where everything was. Mack circled twice before settling near the front doorway, not beside Calvin, between Calvin and the outside world, as if he had already assigned himself guard duty. The old grandfather clock in the corner had stopped decades ago. Its hands remained frozen at 11:17. Time had abandoned this place long before people did. Calvin leaned against his rolled-up jacket. The silence returned. He closed his eyes. For a while, exhaustion won. Then metal crashed somewhere above him. His eyes snapped open. Instantly, his body reacted before his mind caught up. He rolled off the sleeping bag, hit the floor, found cover behind an overturned cabinet. Heart hammering, breathing controlled, waiting. The mansion disappeared. For half a second, he wasn't in Wyoming anymore. He was back in Iraq. Dust, heat, radio chatter. The sound of incoming contact. He could almost smell diesel fuel and burning concrete. Then reality returned. Cold air, stone walls, darkness. The mansion. Mack stood immediately, ears forward, listening. Both remained motionless. 1 minute, 2. Nothing followed, no voices, no footsteps. No second impact, just the wind. Calvin slowly rose to one knee. His right hand trembled slightly, not from fear, from memory. He rubbed the scar near his wrist and exhaled through his nose. Just the house settling. The words sounded unconvincing even to him. Mack continued staring upward. The dog wasn't buying it either. Calvin grabbed the flashlight. Let's check. The beam cut through darkness as they climbed the staircase. Each step groaned beneath his weight. The upper floor smelled different, older, colder. A section of roof had collapsed years ago. Moonlight poured through the opening. Silver light covered broken furniture and fallen plaster. The source of the noise revealed itself quickly. An old metal bed frame had finally tipped over. Nothing more. No intruders, no animals, no mystery. Still, Calvin completed a full sweep of the second floor, room by room, window by window, clear. Only after reaching the final bedroom did he relax. Slightly. Back downstairs, he tried sleeping again. Hours passed, then another sound, a metallic clink, sharp, brief, outside. This time, Mack was already standing before Calvin opened his eyes. The dog emitted a low growl. Calvin reached for the flashlight. No sudden movements, no panic, just observation. The sound came again. Clink, metal against metal. From somewhere near the rear of the property, near the old barn. Calvin moved to the window. The valley lay under moonlight. The cars looked like rusted skeletons. The airplane stood silent. Nothing moved. Then the sound stopped completely. He stayed awake another hour, listening, watching. Eventually, exhaustion dragged him into shallow sleep. The nightmare came just before dawn. A helicopter descending into a dusty landing zone. Rotor wash, men shouting, smoke, then silence, the terrible kind. The kind that comes after bad news. Calvin woke with his fists clenched. Mack's nose pressed against his shoulder. The dog remained there until Calvin's breathing slowed. Outside, the first light of morning painted the valley blue. Calvin sat up. His back ached, his neck hurt. He hadn't truly slept. Not really. But dawn brought something useful. Evidence. While walking the property with a mug of instant coffee, he noticed tracks near the old barn. Fresh tracks. Not animal tracks, boot prints. He crouched carefully. The impressions remained sharp, made within the last day, possibly within the last few hours. Someone had been here, recently. Calvin scanned the tree line automatically. Distance, elevation, possible observation points. Again, old habits. Mack sniffed the ground, then followed the trail. The tracks led directly toward the barn. The structure sat several hundred yards from the mansion. Its red paint had faded almost white. One wall leaned slightly. The roof sagged, yet the door stood partially open. Calvin didn't remember leaving it that way. His grip tightened on the flashlight. Mack moved ahead, silent, focused. The barn interior smelled of oil and dust. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the boards. The place appeared empty. At first, then Calvin saw it. Parked beneath a canvas tarp near the back wall, a vehicle. Large, boxy, military green. He pulled the tarp aside. Dust exploded into the air. A Jeep. Not just any Jeep, military issue. Old, probably Vietnam era, maybe older. Its tires were flat, paint peeling, rust spreading across the body. But something immediately caught his attention. The identification numbers had been deliberately ground away. Not weathered, not faded, removed. Every serial marking, every registration plate, gone. Calvin stared at the metal. A chill crept up his spine. Vehicles don't erase their own history. People do. Mack suddenly stopped sniffing. His head lifted. The dog's eyes fixed on the open barn doorway. Watching. Listening. Exactly as he had done the night before. Calvin slowly turned. The valley outside remained empty. Yet the same feeling returned. That sensation from the window. From the woods. From the darkness. The unmistakable feeling that somewhere beyond the property line, unseen eyes were watching the mansion. And watching them. Calvin stood in the barn doorway for several seconds, staring across the valley. Nothing. Only sunlight spilling across tall grass and distant pine trees. Yet the sensation remained. The same instinct that had once warned him to duck half a second before incoming fire. The same instinct that had carried him through places where hesitation got people killed. Mack never took his eyes off the tree line. Finally, Calvin stepped back inside. Let's see what this place has been hiding. The rest of the morning became a mission. Not an official one. Not anymore. But it felt familiar. He found an old notebook in the truck and began documenting everything. Vehicle locations, building conditions, landmarks, distances, possible access roads. Years ago, he would have called it building a picture of the AO. Now it was simply the habit of a man who trusted preparation more than luck. The first vehicle sat closest to the mansion. A faded blue pickup. Its tires had long ago become part of the earth. The interior remained surprisingly clean. No nests, no broken glass, no vandalism. Someone had cared about it once. The second vehicle was an old ambulance-style rescue truck. Its faded paint revealed traces of emergency markings beneath decades of dust. Calvin ran his hand across the side panel. The letters were nearly invisible, but they were there. Mack sniffed around the wheels, then moved on. The third vehicle looked like an old Forest Service truck. The fourth was a heavy-duty four-wheel drive utility rig. Each machine seemed built for a purpose. Not luxury, not collecting, work, real work. The deeper Calvin looked, the stranger it became. Nothing about the collection felt random. These weren't trophies, they were tools. Every vehicle told the same story. Someone had used them hard, maintained them carefully, then left them exactly where they stood, as if a job had been interrupted and never resumed. By noon, Calvin reached the first airplane. Up close, it was even more impressive. Twin propellers, weathered aluminum skin, long wings stretching across the grass. The aircraft rested like a sleeping giant. Mack circled underneath the fuselage. Calvin climbed onto the wing and peered through the cockpit window. Dust coated everything, yet surprisingly little damage existed inside. The controls remained intact. The seats were still there. Even some instruments survived. He opened the cockpit door. The hinges groaned. A smell of old leather and machine oil drifted out. Something about it triggered a memory. For a moment he was 25 again, standing beside a transport aircraft halfway across the world, listening to engines spool up before dawn, watching men board, some returning, some not. The memory disappeared as quickly as it came. Calvin swallowed hard and climbed inside. The cockpit felt frozen in time. Then he saw it. A photograph tucked inside a cracked plastic sleeve. He carefully pulled it free. A man stood beside this very airplane. Tall, broad shoulders, weathered smile. The date written across the bottom corner read, June 14, 1974. Behind the man stood the mansion. Behind the mansion stood the mountains, exactly as they appeared today. Only younger, alive. The back of the photo contained a single handwritten note. Nathan. ready for another storm. Calvin read it twice, Nathan. The name Earl had never mentioned. The name that somehow felt important. Mack barked suddenly, sharp, one time. Calvin immediately looked up. The dog stood at the edge of the grass, facing the hillside behind the mansion. The same direction as before, the same place again. Calvin sighed. You're obsessed with that hill. Mack didn't move. The dog remained fixed on something Calvin couldn't see. After several seconds, he finally trotted away. Calvin shook his head. Probably a rabbit or deer. The property was full of wildlife. The second airplane sat farther away near the northern edge of the valley. This one looked different, less damaged, better preserved. The tires remained inflated. The windows were intact. Even the paint remained visible beneath the dirt. Calvin slowly walked around it. A strange feeling settled over him. Someone had taken care of this aircraft much longer than the others, almost as if they expected it to fly again someday. Near the landing gear, he noticed fresh scratches in the dirt. Not old marks, recent ones. Days old at most. He crouched immediately. His pulse quickened. The scratches looked deliberate, like something heavy had been dragged. The trail vanished beneath grass before he could determine where it led. Again that feeling returned. Someone else had been here recently, very recently. By late afternoon, Calvin had completed most of the property survey. 11 vehicles, 2 airplanes, 3 outbuildings, the barn, a machine shed, a collapsed workshop. Nothing explained why everything had been abandoned. Nothing explained why someone had removed identification numbers from the military jeep. Nothing explained the footprints. And nothing explained why Mack kept returning to the hillside. As the sun dropped toward the western mountains, Calvin sat on the mansion's front steps. A notebook rested on his knee. Mack lay beside him. The valley glowed gold beneath the evening light. For the first time since arriving, Calvin felt something unexpected. Curiosity. Not fear, not regret. Curiosity. The kind that keeps a man moving forward. The kind that had gotten him into trouble more than once. A vehicle approached from the distant road. Dust followed behind it. Calvin watched carefully. The truck slowed near the gate, then continued past without stopping. A local rancher, probably. Still, his eyes followed it until it disappeared. Mack lifted his head, watching, always watching. The sun finally disappeared behind the mountains. Long shadows filled the valley. Then Mack stood, without warning, without hesitation. He began walking toward the hillside once more. Not running, not chasing anything, simply moving with quiet certainty. Halfway there, he stopped and looked back, waiting. Almost as if he expected Calvin to follow. Calvin stared at him. The dog held his gaze, then looked toward the hill again, back toward Calvin. Then the hill. Again, a silent invitation, or a warning. Calvin couldn't tell which. The old soldier slowly rose from the steps. Something in Mack's behavior felt different this time. More urgent, more deliberate. As darkness settled across the valley, Calvin found himself staring toward the hillside, toward whatever had captured the dog's attention since the moment they arrived. And for the first time, he began wondering if Mack wasn't chasing wildlife at all. Maybe the dog was trying to show him something. Something hidden, something waiting, something connected to the man in the photograph, Nathan. Calvin spent most of the night thinking about the name. The wind rattled loose branches against the mansion walls. The old structure groaned occasionally, settling into the cold mountain darkness. Mack slept near the front door, or at least appeared to. Every so often one ear would twitch. Every so often his head would lift, listening, waiting. By sunrise, Calvin had made up his mind. If he wanted answers, they wouldn't be hiding inside the mansion. They would be in town. The nearest town sat nearly 40 minutes away. A small Wyoming community tucked between mountains and cattle ranches, one main street, a gas station, a diner, a feed store, a church, and a library. The kind of place where people remembered things, sometimes longer than they should. Calvin parked outside the diner first. The bell above the door jingled as he entered. Conversations briefly paused, not completely, just enough. Small towns always noticed strangers, especially old strangers living in abandoned mansions. Mack followed close beside him. Several customers glanced at the dog. Most smiled. A few nodded. One elderly rancher pointed toward Mack. "That's a good-looking shepherd." Calvin smiled faintly. "Best partner I've ever had." The rancher laughed. "Probably smarter than most people around here." That earned a few chuckles. For the first time since arriving, Calvin felt the tension ease slightly. He ordered coffee, listened. People always talked when they forgot someone was listening. By the time he finished his second refill, he had heard the mansion mentioned 3 times. Never directly, always indirectly. The old place, the valley property, the Hale land. Each conversation ended the same way. A sudden silence. A change of subject, as if everyone knew something, and nobody wanted to be the first person to say it aloud. The library stood 2 blocks away. The building itself looked older than the town around it. Red brick, white columns, large windows. The scent of paper greeted him the moment he entered. Behind the front desk sat an elderly woman with silver hair pulled into a neat bun. Reading glasses rested low on her nose. She looked up as the door opened. Then her eyes widened slightly, not at Calvin, at Mack. "Well now," she said softly. "What a handsome gentleman." Mack immediately walked over, tail wagging once. The woman smiled. "He knows good people." Calvin approached the desk. "I'm looking for information about someone." Her eyes shifted toward him. "Who?" He pulled the photograph from his jacket pocket. The woman adjusted her glasses, looked down, then froze. For several seconds, she didn't speak, didn't move. When she finally looked up, something had changed in her expression. Recognition, and something else. Sadness. "Where did you find this?" "The mansion." The woman slowly removed her glasses. "I thought so." She looked at the photograph again. Nathan Hale. The name sounded different when she said it, like it belonged to someone real. Someone remembered. "Who was he?" Calvin asked. The woman leaned back in her chair. Outside, a pickup truck rolled past the window. The library suddenly felt quieter, older, as if they had stepped into another decade. "My name is Ruth Wheeler," she said. "I've lived here 82 years. She touched the edge of the photograph gently. "And when I was a little girl, Nathan Hale was already a legend." Calvin sat down. Mack settled beside his chair. Ruth stared toward the mountains visible through the window. Nathan wasn't rich, he wasn't famous. But when people got into trouble up there, she pointed toward the peaks. He came. Her voice softened. Snowstorms, wildfires, floods. If somebody was stranded, Nathan flew. Calvin listened carefully. The old instincts returned. Gathering information. Building a picture. By himself? Ruth shook her head. No. A faint smile appeared. He had help. She stood slowly and walked toward a cabinet. After several minutes, she returned carrying a thin archive box. Newspaper clippings, old photographs, faded articles. She laid them across the table. Calvin stared. There was Nathan, standing beside one of the airplanes, standing beside rescue crews, standing beside people he had saved. One article showed him carrying a young girl through deep snow. Another showed him unloading supplies after a mountain storm. The dates stretched across decades. Always helping. Always returning to the mountains. People trusted him, Ruth said quietly. More than they trusted the government sometimes. Calvin picked up another clipping. The headline read, "Local pilot saves family." During blizzard, Nathan smiled from the photograph. The same smile from the picture inside the airplane. The same eyes. Steady. Confident. Calvin understood immediately why people followed him. Some men carried authority naturally. Nathan looked like one of them. What happened to him? The question lingered in the room. Ruth's smile disappeared. She looked down at her hands. For a moment, Calvin thought she wouldn't answer. Then she sighed. No one knows. The words landed heavily. He disappeared. When? Nearly 40 years ago. Calvin frowned. No body, no plane wreck, no explanation. She shook her head. One day he was here. The next day he wasn't. The silence that followed felt strangely familiar. Calvin had seen it before. Military funerals without remains. Families without answers. People left behind. What about the mansion? Ruth looked toward the window again. The property slowly died after that. No one stayed. No one kept it up. The airplanes remained. The vehicles remained. The years passed. Her gaze returned to Calvin. You bought that place, didn't you? Calvin nodded. Ruth smiled sadly. Then you're probably the first person who actually wants to know the truth. A sudden scraping sound interrupted them. Mack had stood up. The dog walked toward the library entrance. Nose low, focused. Ruth noticed immediately. What's he doing? Calvin followed Mack outside. The dog crossed the sidewalk, stopped beside a flower bed, and began digging. Not wildly, not playfully, deliberately. 3 scratches. 4, 5. Then something metallic appeared beneath the dirt. Calvin crouched, brushed away soil. A small rusted plate emerged, bolted long ago to something larger. Letters still visible beneath corrosion. Ruth leaned closer. The color drained from her face. The plate read, Project Sentinel. Neither of them spoke. Mack stared toward the distant mountains. And for the first time since arriving in Wyoming, Calvin saw genuine concern in Ruth Wheeler's eyes. Where did you find that? She whispered. Because whatever Project Sentinel was, she already knew the name, and she clearly wished she didn't. Ruth Wheeler glanced around the sidewalk before speaking again. The small-town street remained quiet. A delivery truck rolled past. A teenager crossed the road carrying a backpack. Nothing unusual. Yet Ruth lowered her voice anyway. I haven't heard those words in over 30 years. Calvin looked down at the rusted metal plate in his hand. Project Sentinel. The letters were barely visible beneath layers of corrosion. What was it? He asked. Ruth hesitated. The hesitation told him more than her answer. I don't know exactly. You don't believe that? The old librarian sighed. No, I don't. For several moments she stared toward the mountains. When Nathan disappeared, people talked. Small towns always do. She folded her arms. Some said he found something in those mountains. Others claimed he was helping people the government didn't want helped. Most of it was gossip. She looked at the plate again. But that name kept showing up. Project Sentinel. The words lingered between them. What happened to it? No one knew. What happened to Nathan? No one knew that either. Calvin slipped the plate into his jacket pocket. Ruth's expression hardened. If I were you, I'd be careful. The warning sounded sincere. Because of the project. Because of questions. She smiled sadly. Questions have a way of attracting attention. The drive back to the mansion felt longer than usual. Gray clouds gathered over the mountains. Snow threatened on the higher peaks. Mack sat upright in the passenger seat the entire trip, watching the road, watching the horizon, watching everything. When the mansion finally appeared beyond the valley, Calvin felt something strange. Not comfort. Ownership. For the first time in years, there was a place waiting for him. Even if it was falling apart. Even if it carried secrets. The moment the truck stopped, Mack jumped out. He didn't head toward the house. He didn't head toward the barn. He headed directly toward the hillside. Again. The same hillside. The same patch of ground. The same stubborn obsession. Calvin watched him disappear through waist-high grass. You're really not giving up, are you? Mack barked once. The answer seemed obvious. By afternoon, Calvin had unpacked the last of his supplies. The sky darkened. Wind moved across the valley. The temperature dropped steadily. Still, Mack remained near the hill. Hours passed. The dog barely touched his food. He returned only long enough to drink water before racing back. By sunset, Calvin's patience finally broke. All right. He grabbed a shovel from the truck bed. You win. Mack immediately jumped to his feet, tail wagging, not excited, relieved, as if he'd been waiting for that decision all day. Together they climbed the slope behind the mansion. The hillside overlooked the valley. From here, Calvin could see everything. The airplanes, the vehicles, the mansion, the road leading into town. It was a good observation point. A military mind noticed such things automatically. Mack led him another 100 yards. Then stopped. The dog began scratching furiously. Dirt flew behind him, the same spot, the exact same spot. Calvin drove the shovel into the ground, once, twice, 3 times. The soil was surprisingly loose. After 20 minutes, a shallow pit had formed. Nothing. Calvin wiped sweat from his forehead. Maybe this time you've actually lost your mind. Mack ignored him. The dog continued digging beside the hole. Then suddenly stopped, his ears lifted. Calvin heard it too. A metallic sound. Clang. The shovel had struck something. Both froze. Calvin knelt immediately. His pulse quickened. He cleared away more dirt with his hands. Metal emerged beneath the soil. Flat, smooth, artificial. Not a rock, not debris. A steel surface, large, very large. The deeper he dug, the bigger it became. Soon the edges appeared, a rectangular outline, almost perfectly hidden beneath decades of earth and vegetation. Calvin sat back. His military instincts surged to life. Nothing about this looked natural. Nothing about it looked civilian. The steel was thick, industrial, and engineered. Mack stood beside him, breathing heavily, watching every movement. The old soldier brushed away another layer of dirt, then found what looked like a recessed handle. His heartbeat accelerated. He grabbed it, pulled, nothing. The mechanism hadn't moved in years, maybe decades. Calvin fetched a pry bar from the truck. The work continued through fading daylight. The wind grew colder. Clouds swallowed the sun. Finally, with a groan that echoed beneath the earth, something shifted. Metal scraped against metal, a sound unlike anything he'd heard since arriving. The hatch lifted barely an inch. Cold air rushed upward. Not mountain air, not cave air. Different, still, preserved. The breath of a place sealed away from the world. Mack immediately backed up. Not from fear, from caution. The same caution Calvin felt. Together they stared at the narrow opening. Darkness waited below. Deep darkness, the kind untouched by sunlight. Calvin widened the gap another few inches, enough to shine his flashlight inside. The beam disappeared downward. Concrete walls, a ladder, depth, far more depth than he expected. The light never reached the bottom. For several seconds neither moved. Wind swept across the hilltop. The valley below grew darker. Night was arriving. Calvin slowly lowered the flashlight. A hidden structure buried beneath the property. Hidden well enough to escape discovery for decades. Hidden well enough that even the townspeople seemed unaware of it. He looked at Mack. The dog stared into the opening. Completely focused. Completely certain. As if this was what he'd been trying to show him since the first night. Calvin swallowed. The name echoed in his mind. Project Sentinel, Nathan Hale, the vanished pilot, the strange vehicles, the erased serial numbers, the fresh footprints. Every mystery suddenly pointed toward the same place. Down, into the darkness beneath the hill. Calvin carefully lowered the hatch again. The metal thudded softly into place. Tomorrow. Whatever waited below had waited decades. One more night wouldn't matter. But, as he and Mack walked back toward the mansion beneath the gathering darkness, Calvin couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the valley, unseen eyes had already noticed what they found. And whoever those eyes belonged to, they would not be happy that the hatch had been opened. That thought stayed with Calvin all night. The wind battered the mansion after midnight. Loose shutters slammed somewhere on the second floor. Rain tapped against broken windows. Mack never left the front room. The German shepherd lay near the doorway, head resting on his paws. But Calvin noticed the dog never truly relaxed. Every few minutes his ears moved, tracking sounds, cataloging them, the same way Calvin used to. Sleep came in fragments. A helicopter rotor echoed through one dream. Men running through dust. A medic shouting coordinates. Someone yelling for help. Then silence. The kind of silence Calvin hated most. He woke before dawn, heart pounding, breathing hard. The old mansion slowly came into focus around him. Stone walls, lantern light, rain. Not Iraq, not Afghanistan, Wyoming. Mack immediately crossed the room and pressed his nose against Calvin's hand. The gesture lasted only a second, yet somehow it steadied him. By sunrise, the storm had passed. Low clouds drifted through the valley. Everything smelled clean, cold, fresh. Calvin drank coffee standing on the front porch. His eyes never stopped moving. Tree line, barn road, hillside, back again. Years in uniform had taught him something simple. When you discover a secret, assume someone else wants it too. The hatch changed everything. Today he intended to find out why. He packed carefully, flashlight, spare batteries, notebook, pocket knife, water, first aid kit, old habits again. Never enter an unknown space unprepared. Mack waited beside the truck, ready. The hike up the hill felt different now. The mystery no longer lived in stories. It had become real. The steel hatch appeared exactly where they had left it. Covered by dirt, half hidden. Invisible unless someone knew where to look. Calvin checked the area first. Tracks. Disturbed soil. Anything unusual. Nothing. At least nothing obvious. He knelt beside the hatch, inserted the pry bar, pulled. Metal groaned. Cold air escaped once again. The same strange stillness, the same scent, old concrete, dry paper, time itself. Mack stood close beside him, watching, waiting. Together they peered into the darkness. The ladder descended farther than Calvin remembered. Concrete walls disappeared below. He switched on the flashlight. The beam vanished into blackness. Let's go. His boots touched the first rung. The metal felt solid. Surprisingly solid. Whoever built this place had expected it to last. Down he climbed, one rung at a time. 10 feet, 15, 20. Finally his boots touched concrete. The flashlight swept across the chamber. Calvin stopped breathing. The room stretched much farther than expected. Not a bunker, not a shelter. Something else. Rows of metal shelving lined the walls. Cabinets, storage crates, filing systems, work tables. Every surface organized with military precision. Dust covered everything, but very little appeared damaged. The underground temperature remained cool and stable. Exactly the kind of environment used to preserve important materials. Mack stepped off the ladder. His nails clicked softly against concrete. The dog moved cautiously through the room, sniffing, investigating. Calvin walked forward slowly. His flashlight revealed labels, maps, boxes, equipment. A radio console occupied one corner. Large, professional, not hobbyist equipment. Communication gear, serious communication gear. Nearby sat stacks of weather logs, flight charts, maintenance records, hundreds of folders, thousands of pages. The deeper his light traveled, the more unbelievable the discovery became. This wasn't one man's storage room. This was an operation, a real operation, built to support something large, something important. Calvin stopped beside a filing cabinet. One drawer remained partially open. Inside rested neatly organized folders, each labeled by year. The dates continued for decades. He opened one carefully. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Mountain rescues, snowstorms, helicopters, aircraft, families, search teams. The next folder contained mission reports. The one after that contained flight logs. Everything documented, everything preserved, as if someone intended history to remember. Yet nobody had Nathan Hale. The name echoed through Calvin's mind. The man in the photograph, the vanished pilot. This place belonged to him. A realization slowly formed. Nathan wasn't simply a pilot. He had built something. Something much larger than himself. Mack suddenly barked, once, sharp. Calvin turned immediately. The dog stood beside a large wall map, pinned with colored markers. Notes covered the edges, coordinates, dates, names. Calvin stepped closer. The map showed hundreds of square miles of Wyoming wilderness, mountain ranges, rivers, remote roads, old airstrips. Every marker corresponded to a handwritten notation. Search. Supply drop, medical evacuation, storm response, rescue, 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 again and again. Nathan's entire life seemed spread across the wall. A lifetime spent helping strangers, a lifetime hidden beneath the hill. Calvin felt an unexpected weight settle in his chest. He understood service. He understood sacrifice. But this was different. No medals, no recognition, no headlines, just decades of work because somebody needed help. Mack wandered deeper into the archive. His tail moved slowly. Then he stopped beside a metal cabinet near the back wall. The cabinet door stood slightly open. Calvin approached. Inside rested several thick binders. Unlike everything else, these carried warning labels. Red ink, block letters. His flashlight lingered on the first binder, classified. The second carried the same marking. So did the third and the fourth. Calvin stared silently. The temperature suddenly felt colder. The archive had already raised countless questions. Now it had created 100 more. Because rescue pilots didn't usually keep classified files beneath abandoned mansions. And whatever answers Nathan Hale left behind, they were waiting inside those binders. Calvin stared at the cabinet for a long moment. Dust floated through the beam of his flashlight. The underground archive felt impossibly still. No wind, no creaking boards, no sounds from the outside world, only silence. The kind of silence that builds over decades. Mack sat beside him, watching, waiting. Calvin carefully pulled the first binder from the shelf. The cover was thick and worn. A date had been stamped across the front. Below it appeared a handwritten note, Storm Response Operations. He opened it. The first page contained photographs, not military photographs, not government photographs, rescue photographs, snow-covered mountains, broken vehicles, helicopters, search teams, families wrapped in blankets, children being carried through blizzards. Each image was carefully labeled, each rescue documented, each life remembered. Calvin turned another page, then another. Soon he stopped reading and simply stared. The scale of it was unbelievable. Nathan Hale had not been operating alone. Names appeared everywhere. Pilots, doctors, volunteer firefighters, forest rangers, sheriffs, nurses, meteorologists. An entire network, one that seemed to stretch across several states. A network built for one purpose, saving lives. Mack suddenly nudged Calvin's arm. The old soldier looked up. The dog stood beside another table. On it lay a large leather journal, older than everything else. The cover carried a simple inscription, Nathan Hale. Calvin sat down carefully. The journal opened with a crackle of aging paper. The first pages described weather patterns, flight notes, equipment maintenance. But gradually, something changed. The entries became personal. The man behind the legend began to appear. September 12, 1958. Snowstorm approaching the North Ridge. Margaret says conditions will worsen by midnight. She's usually right. Calvin smiled faintly. He turned another page. October 3, 1961. Rescued a father and daughter trapped near Granite Pass. Margaret spotted the pressure drop before anyone else. Saved us 6 hours. Another entry. February 9, 1964. 3 lost hikers located. Margaret refused to sleep until we found them. The same name appeared again and again and again. Margaret. Nathan's wife. Calvin kept reading. The deeper he went, the more the story unfolded. Nathan had flown the aircraft. Margaret had predicted the storms. Together they had built something extraordinary. A private rescue network operating in places too remote for conventional help. They tracked weather, maintained equipment, monitored emergency calls, coordinated volunteers. Sometimes they arrived before official rescue teams even knew someone was missing. Hours passed. Calvin barely noticed. One journal led to another. Another led to photographs. Photographs led to maps. Maps led to mission reports. A pattern emerged. Each of the 11 vehicles on the property corresponded to major rescue operations. The Jeep had been used during mountain searches. The ambulance truck transported survivors. The utility rigs carried supplies. Nothing had been collected. Everything had been earned. Every vehicle represented people who came home alive. Calvin found himself staring at an old photograph. Nathan stood beside one of the aircraft. A younger woman stood beside him. Dark hair, strong eyes, weather notebook tucked beneath her arm. Margaret. They weren't posing for the camera. They were looking at each other, smiling. The kind of smile people wear when they've spent a lifetime trusting one another. For a moment, Calvin thought of Diane, his wife, the hospital room, the machines, the final weeks. The memory hit unexpectedly, like a wave. He closed the journal, lowered his eyes. Mack quietly walked over and rested his head on Calvin's knee. The dog seemed to know. Somehow he always knew. Calvin scratched behind Mack's ears. The ache passed slowly. Then something else caught his attention. A large wall display covered with photographs. Dozens. People of every age. Families, children, elderly couples, rescue crews. Each image carried a date and a location. Every single one represented someone Nathan and Margaret had helped. The wall wasn't a trophy display. It was a record, a reminder. Proof that every mission mattered. Calvin stood there for a long time, looking at faces, looking at lives, looking at people who probably never knew how much effort had gone into saving them. He understood that feeling. Most service happened quietly. Most sacrifice happened quietly. The world usually noticed only the headlines, never the thousands of ordinary moments underneath. Mack suddenly growled, low, sharp, different. Calvin turned immediately, every instinct activated. The dog wasn't looking at the archive. He was staring toward the ladder, toward the hatch. Someone was above them. The realization arrived instantly. Calvin switched off the flashlight. Darkness swallowed the room. He listened. Nothing. Then came the sound. A footstep. Soft, careful. Above ground, Mack's growl deepened. Calvin's pulse quickened. Someone was moving around near the entrance. Not an animal, not the wind, a person. The sound lasted only a few seconds, then stopped completely. Silence returned. The kind of silence that felt wrong. Calvin waited 1 minute, 2, 5. Nothing followed. Eventually he climbed the ladder, slowly, carefully. The hatch remained exactly where he left it. No signs of forced entry, no visible tracks. Yet something had been there. Of that he was certain. Back outside, evening shadows stretched across the valley. The mountains glowed orange beneath the setting sun. Everything looked peaceful, beautiful, normal. But Calvin knew better. He scanned the tree line, the road, the ridges, observation points, possible approaches. Someone knew about the archive, or at least suspected something existed beneath the hill. Mack remained tense all the way back to the mansion. The dog kept looking over his shoulder, toward the forest, toward the fading light, toward whoever had come close enough to hear them. And somewhere beyond the property line, hidden among the pines and shadows, another pair of eyes had likely been watching, waiting, learning. And now they knew one thing for certain. The old veteran and his dog had found something worth protecting. 3 days later, the first offer arrived. Calvin was repairing a broken section of fence near the driveway when a black SUV appeared on the road. The vehicle looked completely out of place. Too clean, too expensive, too polished for a valley where most trucks carried mud and cattle dust. Mack noticed it immediately. The German shepherd stopped chewing on a stick and stood. His ears rose, his eyes narrowed. The SUV rolled through the open gate and stopped 20 yards away. A man stepped out, mid-50s, tailored jacket, perfect haircut, the kind of person who looked uncomfortable standing near dirt. He smiled, not warmly, professionally. "Mr. Brooks?" Calvin leaned against the fence post. "Depends who's asking." The man laughed politely. "My name is Richard Dawson." He handed over a business card. Rockridge Minerals, Regional Development Division. Calvin glanced at it, then slipped it into his pocket. "What do you want?" Dawson looked around the property, the mansion, the airplanes, the vehicles, the hills, calculating, evaluating, like a man inspecting merchandise. Our company owns significant land holdings throughout the region. Calvin already disliked him. We're interested in acquiring this property. No, Dawson blinked. I haven't mentioned a price. You don't need to. The smile faded slightly. Mr. Brooks, we're prepared to offer a very generous amount. No, several $100,000. No, the executive's eyes narrowed. Most people would at least listen. Calvin looked toward the airplanes, toward the mansion, toward Mack. I didn't say most people. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The Wyoming wind moved through the valley. Finally, Dawson nodded. Perhaps you'll reconsider. He climbed back into the SUV. Before leaving, he looked once more toward the hillside behind the mansion. The exact hillside. The same one hiding the archive. Calvin noticed, and that bothered him. A lot. The SUV disappeared down the road. Mack continued watching long after it was gone. That night, Calvin installed 2 trail cameras. The first overlooked the driveway. The second covered the hill. Old military habits. Observe first, act second. The next morning, both cameras remained untouched. So did the next day. Then the third morning arrived. The driveway camera still worked. The hill camera did not. Calvin found it hanging from a tree branch, broken. The memory card gone. He crouched beside the damaged device. His jaw tightened. Animals didn't remove memory cards. People did. Mack sniffed the area. The dog followed a scent trail into the woods. Calvin followed for nearly half a mile before the tracks vanished among rocky terrain. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. The realization sat heavily in his stomach. The game had changed. A week later, another visitor arrived. This time it was a lawyer. The silver sedan parked near the mansion. A man carrying a leather briefcase stepped out. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. According to the lawyer, a distant relative of Nathan Hale had surfaced. A great-nephew, or second cousin, or something equally convenient. The details kept changing. The claim remained the same. The land should belong to the family, not Calvin, not the county, not anyone else. The lawyer left behind paperwork, legal language, complicated language, expensive language. Calvin tossed the documents onto the kitchen table. Mack watched from the doorway. You know what's funny? The dog tilted his head. Nobody wanted this place until we found something. Mack's ears twitched, as if agreeing. 3 days later, another incident occurred. Calvin returned from town carrying supplies. The barn door stood open. He had closed it that morning. Immediately, every instinct activated. His posture changed. His breathing slowed. The valley disappeared. The years disappeared. For a brief moment, the 73-year-old veteran became the soldier he used to be. Observe, assess, approach carefully. He motioned for Mack to stay close. Together they crossed the yard. The barn looked normal. Almost. A toolbox sat overturned. Dust had been disturbed. Someone had been inside. Recently. Calvin checked every corner. Nothing missing. Nothing stolen. Yet something felt wrong. Someone wasn't searching for tools. Someone wasn't searching for valuables. They were searching for information. The realization came like a cold draft. The archive, the files, Nathan's records, the hidden bunker. Somebody knew or suspected. That evening, Calvin sat inside the underground archive. The journals lay open across the table. Nathan's life surrounded him. Mission reports, photographs, maps, records, evidence, history. Mack slept nearby, at least until a folder slid loose from one shelf. The contents spilled onto the floor. Calvin knelt to gather them. One document caught his attention. A handwritten note, folded several times, hidden between unrelated reports, not labeled, not catalogued, almost concealed. He unfolded it. The paper contained only a few lines, written in Nathan's handwriting. If anything happens to me, the evidence remains below. Protect the records. Protect Margaret's work. Protect the truth. Calvin stared at the words, then turned the page over. A coordinate grid appeared on the back, along with a list of names. Some crossed out, some circled. One circled name appeared repeatedly throughout multiple classified files. Calvin recognized it immediately, because the same name appeared on the business card sitting in his pocket upstairs. Richard Dawson. For a moment the archive seemed colder, much colder. The mining company wasn't interested in minerals. Not really. The lawsuit wasn't about family inheritance. Not really. The cameras hadn't been destroyed by curiosity. Not really. All of it pointed toward something buried inside Nathan's records. Something valuable. Something dangerous. Something important enough that people were willing to lie for it. Above ground, the wind struck the mansion. The old structure groaned softly. Mack suddenly lifted his head. The dog stared toward the ceiling, listening, alert again. Calvin slowly closed the file. Because somewhere outside, beyond the darkness surrounding the valley, other people were moving. Other people were planning. And whatever they wanted, it wasn't the land. It was something hidden inside the story Nathan Hale had left behind. Calvin spent the next week trying to determine exactly what that something was. The answer remained frustratingly out of reach. The classified binders contained references to rescue operations, emergency supply routes, weather monitoring systems, and communications networks stretching across hundreds of miles of wilderness. Nothing illegal, nothing scandalous, nothing that explained why people were suddenly willing to fight over the property. Yet Nathan's repeated warnings suggested otherwise. Protect the records. Protect the truth. The words lingered in Calvin's thoughts. Winter arrived early. A heavy snowstorm rolled down from the mountains one evening, swallowing the valley beneath sheets of white. The mansion looked almost beautiful beneath the snow. The rusted vehicles became ghostly shapes. The airplanes stood frozen beneath drifting snowbanks. By nightfall, visibility had dropped to almost nothing. The wind screamed across the valley. Mack refused to leave Calvin's side. The dog paced near the windows repeatedly, watching, listening, waiting. Around midnight, Calvin woke suddenly. Not from a nightmare. From silence. The storm had weakened, and something else had replaced it. A sound faint, metal. His eyes opened instantly. Years disappeared. Training remained. The sound came again. A soft scrape outside. Near the barn, Mack was already standing, every muscle tight. The dog released a low growl. Calvin sat up slowly. No sudden movements, no lights, no unnecessary noise. He moved toward the window. Snow reflected enough moonlight to illuminate the property. At first he saw nothing. Then movement. A shadow. Someone crossing between the barn and the machine shed. The figure carried a flashlight covered by a hand. Trying not to be seen. Trying not to be noticed. Calvin's jaw tightened. The archive. The intruder wasn't here for tools, or shelter, or old airplanes. The person was heading toward the hill, toward the hatch. Calvin grabbed his coat. Flashlight. Radio. The old military field jacket he still wore during cold weather. Mack was already at the door. Ready. The snow crunched beneath their boots. The wind had nearly died. Every sound carried farther. Calvin kept low, moving carefully, observing before acting. The figure reached the hillside, stopped, then began searching, exactly where the hatch was hidden. The old soldier felt his pulse accelerate. Whoever this was knew where to look. The person wasn't guessing, they knew. Mack suddenly froze. The German shepherd's ears locked forward. His posture changed instantly. Danger. Real danger. Calvin saw it a fraction of a second later. The intruder wasn't alone. A second figure emerged from the trees, then a third, watching, covering, organized, not professionals, but coordinated. The old instincts screamed, contact. Calvin immediately stepped behind a cluster of rocks. Mack remained beside him, silent, waiting for direction. Then one of the intruders reached the hatch. A flashlight beam swept across the ground. The hidden entrance was seconds from discovery. Mack made the decision before Calvin could. The dog exploded forward, a blur of black and tan against the snow. The sudden bark shattered the night. The intruders jumped in shock. One stumbled backward. Another swung the flashlight wildly. Mack charged directly between them and the hatch, protecting it, protecting Calvin, protecting the secret he had uncovered. "Hey!" one man shouted. Everything happened quickly after that. Confusion, snow, shouting, the beam of a flashlight cutting through darkness. Calvin moved forward, trying to close the distance, trying to identify faces. Then came a sharp crack. Not thunder, not wood, a gunshot. The sound echoed across the valley. Silence followed, the kind of silence that freezes blood. Then came the sound Calvin feared most, a yelp. Mack. The dog collapsed into the snow. For a second, Calvin couldn't move. The world narrowed. The valley disappeared. The mansion disappeared. Only Mack remained. The intruders ran, vanishing into darkness. Boots pounding through snow, gone within seconds. Calvin didn't chase them. Nothing mattered except the dog. He reached Mack and dropped to his knees. The German shepherd was breathing, fast, painfully. Blood stained the snow beneath his shoulder. Not massive bleeding, but enough. Far too much. No. Calvin's hands moved automatically. Training taking over. Assess. Control bleeding. Stabilize. The wound appeared to have passed through soft tissue near the shoulder. Painful, dangerous, but survivable if treated quickly. Mack tried to stand. Calvin gently pushed him back down. "Easy, partner." The dog's eyes never left his. Trust. Complete trust. The sight nearly broke him. Years ago, Calvin had treated wounded soldiers under worse conditions. But somehow this felt different. Much different. His hands trembled, not from fear, from the possibility of loss. The possibility that one day this dog might not be beside him. The realization struck harder than expected. Harder than any lawsuit. Harder than any threat. Harder than losing the mansion. Because Mack wasn't just a dog anymore. He was family. The last family Calvin had. The old soldier carried him back through the snow, step by step, refusing to stop, refusing to slow down. Inside the mansion, he transformed the kitchen table into an emergency treatment station. Bandages, antiseptic, medical supplies, old military skills resurfacing. Hours passed. By dawn, the bleeding had stopped. Mack slept beneath blankets near the fireplace, exhausted, alive. Calvin sat beside him the entire night, watching every breath, listening to every movement. The rising sun painted the valley gold. Neither man nor dog had slept. Finally, Calvin stepped outside. The snow around the hillside still showed signs of the struggle. Footprints, disturbed ground, broken branches, and something else. Something one of the intruders had dropped during the chaos. Half buried beneath fresh snow. Calvin brushed it clean, a small metal key, attached to a weathered identification tag. The tag carried a number and a name. Archive Locker 12. The exact words Nathan Hale had used repeatedly throughout several classified files. Calvin stared at the key, then toward the hidden archive beneath the hill. Whatever the intruders had been searching for, they hadn't found it, but they had come dangerously close. And now, for the first time, Calvin possessed a clue that might finally reveal what Nathan had spent decades trying to protect. Mack slept most of the following day. The pain medication from the veterinarian in town had finally eased the worst of the suffering. His shoulder remained bandaged. His movements were slower, careful. But every time Calvin entered the room, the German shepherd's tail tapped softly against the floor. Still watching, still guarding, still refusing to quit. Calvin sat beside him for a long time that evening. The old dog rested his head on Calvin's boot. The fire crackled in the stone fireplace. Outside, snow drifted across the valley. The world felt quiet, too quiet. Finally, Calvin stood. He slipped the small key into his pocket. "Let's find out what they wanted." Mack tried to rise. Calvin gently stopped him. "Not this time, partner." The dog looked offended. That almost made Calvin smile. For the first time in days, the archive felt different now, darker, heavier. The attack had changed everything. The mystery was no longer academic. People had already risked prison to reach these files. Someone had hurt Mack trying. That made the answers personal. Calvin moved directly to the back section of the archive. The numbered storage lockers stood against the far wall, 12 of them, old steel compartments, each secured with a lock. Most remained closed, untouched, waiting. Locker 12 sat at the end, almost hidden behind shelves. The key slid into place perfectly. The click sounded louder than it should have. Calvin opened the door slowly. Inside rested a single weatherproof case, nothing else. No gold, no cash, no treasure. Just a black storage case covered with dust, the kind used to protect sensitive equipment or important records. His pulse quickened. He opened it. The first thing he saw was a stack of journals. Not Nathan's, Margaret's. Beneath them lay photographs, maps, letters, government correspondence, newspaper clippings, and one thick folder marked Final Report. Calvin sat at the table. The next several hours disappeared. Piece by piece, the final story emerged. Nathan and Margaret had spent decades building their rescue network. That much Calvin already knew. What he didn't know was how large it became. During severe blizzards, forest fires, floods, avalanches, they often reached victims before anyone else. Sometimes entire communities depended on them. The records documented hundreds of successful missions. Hundreds. Entire families alive because someone answered a radio call in the middle of the night. Entire towns supplied during emergencies. Entire search operations coordinated from this valley. Then Calvin reached the final section. Everything changed. The last files contained correspondence with state agencies, federal emergency services, search and rescue organizations, weather monitoring offices, letters thanking Nathan and Margaret, reports validating their work, records proving countless successful operations. It wasn't just history, it was evidence. Evidence that one of the most effective volunteer rescue networks in the western United States had existed almost entirely outside public awareness. Calvin leaned back, a realization slowly formed. This wasn't merely a local story. This was national history. Then he found the final journal, Nathan's last journal. The handwriting changed near the end. Less steady, more rushed. The entries became shorter. Urgent. December 18. Storm developing faster than forecast. December 19. Missing aircraft reported near Granite Peak. December 20. Conditions deteriorating. Will launch at first light. The next entry stopped Calvin cold. December 21. Margaret says the mountain won't let me come back this time. I told her she's wrong. I hope she is. The page after that contained only coordinates. No explanation, no mission summary, no follow-up report, nothing. The next page was blank. So was the next and the next. The journal ended there. Calvin stared at the final entry. A chill moved through him. Nathan hadn't disappeared. Nathan had gone on one last rescue mission and never returned. The answer had been sitting inside the archive for decades, forgotten, buried, waiting. Calvin immediately pulled the coordinate map from the table. He compared the numbers. The location sat high in the mountains, remote, dangerous, far beyond the normal rescue routes. A place where storms could erase evidence for generations. A place where a small aircraft might never be found. Suddenly everything made sense. The abandoned vehicles, the untouched airplanes, the preserved archive. Margaret had known, maybe not immediately, but eventually. She understood Nathan wasn't coming home, so she protected everything. The records, the history, the evidence, the truth. Calvin felt a lump rise in his throat. He looked around the archive. Around the lifetime Nathan and Margaret had left behind. Neither had become famous. Neither had become wealthy. Yet together, they had saved more lives than most people could imagine. And almost nobody remembered. He opened the final folder. The last document sat inside. A formal recommendation, signed by emergency officials, dated only months before Nathan's final mission. The document proposed national recognition for Nathan and Margaret's rescue work. The recommendation had never been completed, never submitted, never finalized. Everything stopped when Nathan vanished. History simply moved on. But Calvin now held proof. Proof of what they accomplished. Proof of who they were. Proof of what the property truly represented. The realization struck with full force. The land wasn't valuable because of minerals, or development, or inheritance. The land was valuable because it contained evidence. Evidence capable of turning the entire property into a protected historical landmark. A site connected to hundreds of documented rescues. A site linked to agencies across the country. A site worth far more than any mining project. Far more than any lawsuit. Far more than anyone had realized. And suddenly Calvin understood why people were trying so hard to gain control of it. Because if the truth became public, nobody would ever be allowed to destroy the valley. Nobody would ever be allowed to mine it. Nobody would ever be allowed to erase it. Nathan and Margaret would finally receive the recognition they deserved, and powerful people would lose everything they hoped to gain. Above him, somewhere beyond the concrete ceiling, the Wyoming wind moved through the dark pines. The old veteran slowly closed the final file. The mystery was solved, but the fight was only beginning. Because once the truth came to light, the people trying to bury it would become far more dangerous. Calvin wasn't wrong. The first legal notice arrived 4 days later, then another, then 3 more, each thicker than the last, each filled with language designed to intimidate. Property disputes, inheritance claims, environmental reviews, ownership challenges. By the second week, nearly every mailbox delivery brought another attack. Not physical, strategic, the kind of warfare fought in conference rooms instead of battlefields. Calvin sat at the kitchen table one evening surrounded by paperwork. The old mansion creaked softly around him. Snow drifted against the windows. Across the room, Mack slept beside the fireplace. His shoulder was healing. Slowly, a patch of fur had begun growing back around the wound. The scar would remain. Calvin found himself looking at it often. A reminder, a warning, a debt he intended to repay. The phone rang. Ruth. "You need to come to town tomorrow." Her voice sounded unusually serious. "Why?" "They scheduled a county hearing." Calvin straightened. "What kind of hearing?" "The kind where people decide what happens to your property." The meeting took place 3 days later. The courthouse wasn't much larger than a school building. Yet every seat inside was occupied. Reporters, local residents, county officials, lawyers, historians, people Calvin had never seen before. Word had spread. The mystery of Nathan Hale was no longer a secret. Neither was the archive. Richard Dawson sat near the front. Calm, confident, expensive suit, perfect posture. 2 attorneys sat beside him. Across the aisle sat the man claiming to be Nathan's distant relative, the supposed heir, a nervous-looking individual who seemed far more interested in his lawyer's instructions than Nathan's actual story. Calvin immediately noticed something. Neither man looked toward the airplanes. Neither looked toward the mansion. Neither looked toward the historical records displayed near the front. They only looked toward the property valuation documents. Money. That was all they saw. The hearing began. Hours passed. Arguments filled the room. Mining representatives described economic opportunities. Lawyers discussed ownership rights. The alleged relative discussed inheritance. Again and again. The same themes. Profit, control, access. Not once did anyone mention the hundreds of lives Nathan and Margaret had saved. Not once did anyone mention the rescue network. Not once did anyone mention the archive. Calvin felt frustration building. Then the door opened. Everything changed. An elderly woman entered first. She walked with a cane, slowly, carefully. Yet every eye in the room followed her. Ruth stood immediately. Others did too. The woman approached the front table. "My name is Ellen Whitaker." Her voice trembled slightly. "In 1972, my family became trapped during a blizzard. Silence filled the room. My father broke his leg. My brother was 6. We would have died." She paused. "Nathan Hale found us." The room remained silent. Another person stood, then another. Then another, a retired firefighter, a former ranger, an old rancher, a woman carrying faded photographs. Each told a story: rescue, a storm, a flight, a life saved. The stories kept coming, one after another. For nearly 2 hours, something extraordinary happened. The hearing stopped being about land. It became about memory. A man in his 70s held up a newspaper clipping. Nathan brought medicine to our town after the roads closed. A woman displayed an old photograph. Margaret predicted the avalanche that saved my husband. Another spoke quietly. My grandfather was one of the volunteers. The courtroom slowly transformed. The truth Nathan had protected for decades finally emerged. Not through documents, not through lawyers, through people, real people, living proof. The county commissioners listened carefully. So did the reporters. Even Dawson's attorneys stopped taking notes. Then Calvin stood. He hadn't planned a speech, never trusted speeches, but he carried something with him. Nathan's final journal. The room fell silent. Calvin opened it carefully. His fingers paused on the final entry. Nathan flew into the mountains knowing conditions were dangerous. His voice remained steady. He never came home. Several people lowered their eyes. Calvin continued. He wasn't chasing recognition. He wasn't chasing money. He was trying to save somebody. The room stayed silent. Then he held up the final recommendation file. The one intended for national recognition. The one never submitted. The one buried for decades. This belongs to Nathan and Margaret Hale. He looked directly at the commissioners. Not to me. Not to a mining company. Not to somebody who discovered a family connection 50 years too late. His gaze moved toward the audience. It belongs to everybody they helped. The silence afterward felt enormous. Then something unexpected happened. Mack slowly rose from beneath the table. The German shepherd limped forward, his shoulder scar visible, his movement careful, deliberate. The dog stopped beside Calvin. Nothing dramatic, nothing trained, just loyalty, simple loyalty. The same loyalty that had uncovered the archive, protected the hatch, taken a wound and refused to quit. A few people smiled, others wiped their eyes. The dog didn't notice. He only looked up at Calvin. Waiting as always. The hearing concluded near sunset. Outside, snow reflected the orange glow of the setting sun. The mountains stood silent beyond town. Everyone waited. The commissioners disappeared into a private room. Minutes stretched, then an hour. No one left. Finally, the doors opened. The commissioners returned. The lead commissioner unfolded a document. The room became completely still. Calvin felt Mack lean gently against his leg. The old soldier looked toward the front, toward the decision that would determine everything. The mansion, the archive, Nathan, Margaret, airplanes, the vehicles, the valley, the future. The commissioner adjusted his glasses, then began to read. Nobody moved. Nobody coughed. Nobody even shifted in their seats. The entire room seemed to hold a single breath. Outside, evening shadows stretched across the snow-covered streets. Inside, history waited for a verdict. The commissioner cleared his throat. After reviewing the evidence presented, his voice echoed softly through the courtroom. After examining the historical records, witness testimony, rescue documentation, flight logs, weather archives, and preservation reports, Richard Dawson's jaw tightened. The attorneys beside him exchanged nervous glances. Calvin felt Mack lean more heavily against his leg. The dog seemed tired, but determined to remain standing. The commissioner continued. The county hereby recognizes the Hale property as a site of exceptional historical significance. A murmur spread through the room. The commissioner raised a hand. Silence returned. The property will receive immediate protection under state historical preservation guidelines. Another pause. The proposed mining application is denied. The room exploded. Applause, cheers, tears. People rose from their seats. Several of the older residents embraced one another. Ruth covered her mouth, crying openly. The woman whose family Nathan had rescued decades ago wiped tears from her eyes. For a moment, Calvin simply stood there, unable to move, unable to speak. The fight was over. Nathan and Margaret had finally won, even if they were no longer alive to see it. Mack sat carefully beside him. His tail tapped once against the floor. The old soldier looked down, then smiled, a real smile, one he hadn't worn in years. Months later, spring arrived. The valley transformed. Snow melted from the mountains. Wildflowers returned. The old mansion stood beneath blue skies once again. Only now it wasn't abandoned. Workers arrived almost every day. Historians, preservation specialists, volunteers, students. The restoration moved carefully, deliberately. Nobody wanted to erase the property's history. They wanted to preserve it. The 2 airplanes remained exactly where Nathan left them. The 11 vehicles stayed in place. Each one received a small plaque explaining its role in rescue operations. The hidden archive became a protected historical collection. Researchers traveled from across the country to study it. Several national publications wrote articles about Nathan and Margaret Hale. Their rescue network finally received recognition. Long overdue recognition. The federal recommendation Nathan never lived to see was completed. A special ceremony honored both of them. The entire town attended. Calvin sat quietly in the back, Mack beside him, just listening, just watching. That felt right somehow. The attention belonged to Nathan and Margaret, not him. Yet life continued changing. One afternoon, a representative from a nonprofit rescue organization visited the property. They had an idea: the valley, the archive, the history, the rescue legacy. Everything pointed toward the same future. A mountain rescue training center, built on the very land where Nathan and Margaret spent their lives helping others. The project moved forward quickly. Volunteers arrived. Former search and rescue personnel offered assistance. Retired pilots donated equipment. Within a year, the first training classes began. Young men and women learned navigation, emergency response, survival techniques, mountain rescue operations. Exactly the kind of work Nathan would have loved. Exactly the kind of purpose Calvin understood. One morning, nearly 3 years after buying the mansion, Calvin stood on the front porch, watching a group of trainees cross the valley. The sun had just risen. Golden light spilled across the grass. The airplanes glowed softly in the morning haze. Behind him, the restored mansion stood strong. Not new, never new, but alive again. Mack lay beside the porch steps, older now, gray fur spreading around his muzzle. The shoulder injury had healed long ago. Only a small scar remained. The dog opened one eye, watching Calvin. Always watching Calvin. Some things never changed. A school bus arrived later that afternoon. Children climbed out, laughing, talking, pointing excitedly toward the airplanes. A volunteer guide began explaining the history of the property. Nathan, Margaret, the rescue missions, the hidden archive. The children listened carefully. One little girl eventually wandered away from the group. She couldn't have been older than 10. She approached Calvin, who was sitting on the front steps beside Mack. The girl studied the German shepherd, then looked up at Calvin. "Mister?" Calvin smiled. "Yes," the girl pointed toward the mansion. "My teacher said you saved this place." For a moment, Calvin didn't answer. The breeze moved through the valley. Somewhere in the distance, birds crossed above the mountains. He looked toward the airplanes, toward the rescue center, toward the restored property, toward the life he never expected to find again. Then he looked down at Mack. The dog rested his head on Calvin's boot, exactly as he had done 1,000 times before. Calvin scratched behind his ears. The old German shepherd closed his eyes contentedly. Then Calvin looked back at the little girl. "No." His voice was quiet, gentle. "I didn't save this place." The girl frowned. "You didn't?" Calvin shook his head. A smile touched the corner of his mouth. "He did." The girl looked at Mack, then back at Calvin. Confused, Calvin laughed softly. The sound surprised even him, because years earlier, After Diane died, he wasn't sure he would ever laugh again. Not like this, not honestly. The girl smiled and ran back toward her class. Calvin remained on the steps, watching. The afternoon sun drifted lower. The valley glowed gold, the same way it had the day he first arrived. Homeless, alone, broken, with little more than an old truck and a rescue dog nobody wanted. He thought about the closed doors, the hospital bills, the sleepless nights, the memories that still visited sometimes, the ones that arrived with sudden sounds or unexpected flashes of light. They hadn't disappeared completely. Maybe they never would, but they no longer controlled him, because now there was something else. Purpose, a mission, a reason to wake up each morning. The wind moved softly across the valley, through the grass, past the airplanes, around the mansion, the place Nathan and Margaret built, the place Mack discovered, the place that changed everything. As the sun slowly disappeared behind the mountains, Calvin sat quietly on the porch. Mack rested his head on his knee. Neither needed words. For the first time in a very long time, Calvin wasn't looking backward. He wasn't thinking about what he'd lost. He wasn't wondering where he belonged. Because after years of drifting through life without a home, the answer was finally sitting all around him. The abandoned mansion had never been the treasure. The hidden archive wasn't the treasure either. The real treasure was much simpler. A second chance, a purpose worth protecting, and a loyal dog who refused to stop searching until he found it. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. If you believe loyalty like Mack's is one of the most powerful things in the world, leave a simple 1 in the comments. And if you've ever had a dog, a friend, or someone who helped you through your darkest days, leave a 0 so we can honor them together. I read as many comments as I can, and I truly enjoy hearing your stories. If this journey touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next story. Because out there, hidden in forgotten places, small towns, lonely roads, and abandoned corners of America, there are still incredible stories waiting to be discovered. And I can't wait to share the next one with you. Until then, take care of yourself, take care of the people who stand beside you, and never underestimate the difference one loyal companion can make. We'll see you in the next story.